I spoke a lot. There's so much more. But any questions, comments, or concerns, as I always tell my students. Yes.
So you guys discuss like a lot of like underground artists, right? Teologia, more technique artists like that. So would you say that would be like the gospel hip hop, like, and then you kind of like talk down about the mainstream artists. So is there a distinction, or is it that's what I'm kind of confused about?
You know, that it's so tough because, you know, when we think about a culture, right? This is a culture. There's a fashion culture. There's ebonics involved, and there's so many other elements involved to it. But when I'm talking about hip hop, I'm really talking about all of hip hop, because I used to use the slogan, I want that real hip hop. I want the real conscious. I want the real stuff that stimulates my mind, not just my body and for entertainment, right? But there are voices, these are all voices that are representative and indicative of what's happening in our communities. You know, I look at these as social commentaries. So I don't devalue, I'm trying to think of something like a Lil Wayne versus Hassan Salam or Rebel Diaz, because Lil Wayne speaks a lot of things that are representative of communities of color, and he's just expressing it artistically. However, I think now Lil Wayne, who is we're about pretty much the same age, that he's matured enough to sort of move away from that. And that's why I appreciate more on a mainstream level someone like a Jay-Z, because he's not talking about that no more. It's a multimillionaire who talks about art now, but in a cool hip hop way. You know, I would respect that more than someone that's still having that conversation. But I think it's important that when we're talking about even referencing the gospel, it's kind of hard to have just yourself go through it. You need to have different perspectives and books around you in order to get the full essence of that. So I would tell a mother or a parent, pull up this information. You can go to, God, what's the name of that website now? It's literally a thesaurus for hip hop that breaks down all the lyrics. I'm trying to forget the name of it right now. It's called it's not rap radar, but literally if you go and you look up a song and you want to decipher lyrics, it's something that sort of deciphers lyrics. So it's kind of like a good starting point to start conversation. So basically what I'm saying is, just to sum up, is I'm really talking about all of hip hop, 70s, 80s, 90s. Like, you have to study, I always tell people that hip hop should be in the history books. You know what I'm saying? Because it broadens the narrative of so many things, from psychology to sociology to spirituality, and they're good reference points, whether it's mainstream or low stream or middle stream, and that we should talk about that, and that's important. So when I'm talking about artists, I'm really talking about all of them as well. I hold all accountable in hip hop. Yeah. Anybody else have a question? Yes.
Okay, there's a question somewhere in here. It's mostly like, I'm thinking through the parallel you kind of drew between, I guess,
Louder.
Like the narrative of hip hop and then the narrative of, not like Christian faith, I guess. So I guess I'm curious, like, where you think, or how, I guess, the kind of true hip hop, I think is maybe how that will survive in between, I guess, maybe to parallel it to like fundamentalist religion. There's a certain, like, I guess, kind of like violent, angry strand, and then maybe on the other side a more like Constantinian sort of hip hop, like the music of the empire, I guess, like how Constantine adopted Christianity as like the religion of the empire, and I feel like maybe to some extent that's happened with hip hop. It's kind of become the accepted, like, everyone's comforted. That's not really revolutionary, I guess, to a lot of people. I mean, they're like those artists you talked about, but it's kind of, you know, you go to any bar and they're playing hip hop. It's like
right now.
Like,
right now.
It's more like the music. It's
right.
Not really like I guess, like a cutting sort of like speaking truth to power, I guess, sort of thing. So So I don't know. I guess the question would be like, how does true hip hop survive in between those, or what can it say to those two? I guess.
Yeah, and I mean, I like you know, like KRS once said, hip hop will never die, man. I don't see it die because as much as we're moving forward and getting deeper into the matrix, aesthetics will never ever go out of style. You know, I think hip hop brings us back to the very bare essentials of communication and conveying information in a creative way, right? A lot of people make the association, well, the first graffiti stuff was the Egyptian hieroglyphics, you know, that's the way we communicated language, and that was to a large extent how hip-hop also communicated its language, because graffiti or bombing or tagging as it's called were also embedded in trains to tell code and information about what's happening in other boroughs. Not a lot of people talk about that, right? But I also think, again, I don't look at hip-hop like an isolated thing, even though I can go as deep as far back as to Africa, because there are people that that have taught courses from African slavery to hip-hop prison industrial complex, and it's pretty intricate and very interesting to see. But I think that as long as our First Amendment is still, you know, has not become like detrimental or you know or taken away from us, hip hop will always still be here. But I think, again, because it's not an isolated incident, we have to look at hip hop from a broader social perspective, right? In that, you know, we're only getting bits and pieces of information given to us on sort of things that are happening in our own country and culture. But there's so many other things ingrained much more deeper than that. And the only way people will find out more about hip hop is by having these conversations and dialogues and within their communities, and understanding what really hip hop is. You know, it's not just music, it's not just entertainment, but it's actually of a lifestyle. Grandmaster Cass said hip hop didn't invent anything, but we reinvented everything. That's how hip hop survived. It revolutionized the word remix. So we just continue to remix. So all these things that I was hearing in the 80s and 90s were beats that were sampled by soul music, and that soul music had soul power and soul revolutions embedded to it. And I think that we need to have more of those conversations by people that are doing work at the ground level, you know, just as much as how I get on Richard a lot of times. Like, you know, I need to be in the ground. I want to see people, I want to see priests doing the ground work, you know, instead of being in the towers, or in the case of hip hop, hiding behind the A&Rs, you know. But it's interesting, even when I interview mainstream artists, and I've interviewed a lot of them, you look at someone, for example, like a 2 Chainz, raps about every drug, sex, all that, but this guy is 44 years old and went to college. He's brilliant, you know, and we would never know that if we don't hear his story. You know what I'm saying? And I think that's sort of the same sort of parallelism we even find behind Jesus, right? What is that Jesus guy about? What is not really knowing the true story? And I think just like that, we need to kind of like start sharing our stories, which is why one of the things that I'm working on is actually creating a document on that, on uplifting these stories that need to be told. But I think the challenges that we have now from music perspective, because you're just really touching on what you hear in the mainstream, but I think if we it's challenging because we're dealing with the same hegemony that our mainstream media is dealing with, right? The radios continue to play the same thing, so whatever you continue to get fed is what you get, right? It's that fast food. This is fast food music that we're throwing at you. And in the digital age, it becomes that much more easier to continue to feed you off that, not knowing that there are grassroots movements that are locally doing things that are changing, right? So from a systemic political change perspective, hip-hop is actually doing a lot on a local level, but we don't talk about that. And I don't want to put him on the spot, but we got a member from the Temple of Hip-Hop right here, Joseph Sanchez, who's worked with KRS-One. You know what I'm saying? But we don't talk a lot about that kind of stuff. And I think if we do, don't be surprised if you see more of hip hop embedded in the school system, embedded in your after school programs, even though they already are. But we're not having conversations about that.